So in this session, we're going to look at how we can take our Power Server applications and deploy them to Microsoft Azure. So first we have a legal disclaimer, and let's look at the agenda. So the first thing is I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit, just in case you don't know who I am. Then we're going to look at how we create an app service in Microsoft Azure, how we migrate the database to Azure, how we update the Power Server project once we know the URLs for the database server and for the app service. Look at how we deploy the project, and then how we configure the app service. Then I'll have a demo, and then we'll have questions and answers. So first, a little bit about myself. My name is Bruce Armstrong. I work for a company called Integrated Data Services. I've been using Power Builder since about version 1. I'm familiar with a few other languages that I've listed there, and I'm involved in some open source projects related to Power Builder that I've listed there. And then this is a little bit about the company I work for. If you want to know more about us, you just check us out on our website. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at going into Microsoft Azure and creating an app service. Now there's a couple of different ways you could probably run an app in Azure. This happens to be the one I selected to use for this demo. So once we're in there, we need to say create. We need to pick what platform. Well, actually, before we even get to that, there's an option, and I don't know, this UI may change later, but this is a new option here where you can create the web app and the database configuration in a single pass. And so we're gonna use that approach. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new resource group. And then I'm going to select .NET Core for the runtime stack. Now you have some options. You can either do Linux or Windows. I chose to do Windows just because, well, one of the things is when we go to create a path off the root for the web API, that's a lot easier to do in the Windows through the web page here. With Linux, you actually have to do it manually on the server, and so I wanted to do it the simple way. I took the application that I'm going to deploy and I migrated it to SQL Server, so that I knew when I went to Azure that there would be a SQL Server implementation available to me. It's actually called SQL Azure, but it's basically the same thing. And the one thing here, though, and maybe this is just my unfamiliarity with it, but it asks for a database name. Well, you don't want to put in the database name of the database that you're migrating over, because you'll run into a conflict when you try to do the import. And so what you have to do is just call it something else, then import your existing database, and then delete the one you created here. This will get the server created for you, but you don't want that database. And like I said, that just may be my misunderstanding of how you're supposed to make this happen, but that's certainly one way to do it. Okay. After you do that, there's a message down here on the bottom that tells you you'll be able to get credentials from the overview page once you're done. So one thing to watch for here is when you do this through Azure, the first thing it does is it actually drops you into a production profile, which is about $300 or more a month. Since I'm just tinkering, and certainly while you're getting familiar with this, and maybe you're doing your initial deploys before you're ready to go to production, I'd say back that down to dev test. That's going to give you you're being resource constrained, but you're also going to be paying, like here, $13 a month. Or they had one option here where it was free, but There's some of the options that we need to take advantage of that aren't available at the free tier. So I'm gonna do this with the B1 tier. SSL is one of them. If you do it at the free tier, you don't get SSL. Okay, and we said earlier that your credentials could be obtained from the overview tab. That's what we see here. You get the published profile, and that downloads the username and password and the URL for the host name for the database server, and the URL for the app service as well. And this is just an example of what it looks like. So there's the FTP site. You can hit for deploying your files. This is the username and password for the demo database, but we're not going to. The username and password for the demo database that we initially created, which we're not going to actually use. This is the application URL that's going to get created or has been created. This is the host name for the database server and the port it's listening on, and then the admin ID and password for the database server. So you just grab all that information, and you can just download it, but you just want to make sure you get it. Now, one thing I'll mention here, there's a lot of ways that you can deploy your Power Server application to Azure. Azure supports web deploys, FTP deploys, zip deploys. So you can actually take your application, zip it, and there's a special deployment area where you deploy as a zip, and Azure will actually run it right out of the zip file. It won't uncompress it. And there's some advantages of doing that. In particular, you don't have to worry about files being locked when you go to upgrade your source. But it also supports, you can point it at a Git repository and basically tell it to do a build. And it will pull the latest source code from Git and do a build and deploy it that way. Or if you want, you can do your builds into a Docker repository and then point Azure at the Docker repository, and it will bring down the image from there. So, and I believe there are other sessions at Elevate where they look at those, particularly those last two options. But what I'm going to cover is just the FTP deploy, just to keep things simple. So, if your database is SQL Server, as it was in my case, there is an option directly built into the Microsoft Server Management Tool to deploy your database to Microsoft Azure. So we're going to take advantage of that. Note, when I do the connection here, the host name that was given to me begins with TCP:. You need to include that. So, and this is from that credentials file we downloaded. So you put in that host name and the username and password from that file, and then it will it will prompt you on your local machine if you're not logged into Azure. It will prompt you to sign into Azure, and it will actually open a port automatically on the firewall in the server for the machine you're doing the deploy from, so that 1433 isn't open to the entire world. It's just open to your specific machine for this migration. Okay, now we're going to look at the Power Server project. We've got what we got right now is we've got our app service created, but there's no code in it. And we've got our database in Azure. Now we need to take our Power Server project and update it to point to where the database is in Azure and what the URL will be for the application in Azure. So what I'm doing here is I've gone into our Power Server project. I've gone to the Web APIs tab. I've gone to the database connection information, and this is connection caches, and I'm changing the connection cache to point to the Azure database. And once again, notice that there's a TCP prefix on the host name. Okay. The other thing we need to change is in the Web API tab is the Web API URL. And what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to deploy this is that I'm going to have the root of my app service, which is going to just be pdemo.azurewebsites.net, and I'm going to have 3 folders underneath there. There's going to be, or 3 paths. There's going to be a path for the Cloud App Publisher, a path for the application itself, and then I'm going to have a path for the Web API. So instead of just having this pointing at the host and a port name, I'm actually going to have it be host and the path. Now that's going to cause a little bit of an issue, and I'll get into that later. When we make our C# changes. Also, I'm going to go into the deployment tab, client deployment tab, and because we're doing this through FTP, we can't connect directly to the server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to package this as a zip file, and I'm going to include everything. I take that back. You can, if you do, say, deploy directly to the server, it does give you the option to do FTP. The problem is what the Power Builder client does is it deploys directly to the root folder, and that's not what I want. I want that. You remember I was talking about the 3 directory structure. I want the files deployed on a path underneath the root. In fact, it gets worse than that. When they give you the URL, I probably have to scroll back like 20 screens, so I'm not going to do that. But when they give you the URL, the FTP URL that you're going to connect to, it actually starts off, the root of that FTP server is like 3 levels above the www root folder. So if you deployed to the root of that, you're way off as far as where the files need to be deployed to. And I pointed this out to Appian, so hopefully they'll address it in a later version. But it would really help is in the FTP deploy option if we could specify a root underneath the folder that we want to deploy to, so we can navigate down, particularly with Azure here, the 3 or 4 directories we need to go down before we actually do the deploy. Okay, now we're going to go to our C# project, and we're going to create a profile for publishing the Web API code. So you hit the Publish button, and you'll get a zip file. Now what I want to do is unzip the when you did the client deployment, it created a single zip file with the name application name _ installer, or at least that's the way I did it. What I want to do though is I want to unzip those 2 folders, the 2 folders that are in that file, and have them separate. So this is I've taken that zip file, unzipped it, taken those 2 folders and my Web API folder from the Web API publish that I did. And now I've got these 3 folders. These are the 3 folders I wanted to deploy to Azure. Now, one thing I found is that, I don't have this problem with other websites I've deployed to, but with Azure, when you take the Cloud App Publisher, that's the parent here, the Cloud App Pub. Let me zoom in there a bit. So this is the contents of the Cloud App Publisher zip file, or the directory. And underneath the Cloud App install, there is a JSON file that the Cloud App Publisher accesses when it's downloading the runtime. And for some reason with Azure, it's not configured to actually allow the download of JSON files, and so that will get blocked, and your client app publisher won't run. And so what you need to do here is actually create a web.config file that looks like this. Basically, it just does a MIME mapping for JSON files. And once you've done that, once you've created the MIME mapping for JSON files, then Azure will allow the download of the JSON file, and your Cloud App Publisher will work correctly. So that needs to be in the root of the Cloud App Publisher folder. Okay, now the one thing we need to do before we deploy our project, and you can actually make this change in the C# code before you do your deploy. I didn't happen to do it in this case, but if you do that, it won't get over. Well, actually, it will get overridden every time you deploy. What happens is, remember I said that I wanted, this is the URL that the web API is going to be seen on, and so it doesn't have that :5000. And I wanted it under this folder, and so I put that in as the web API URL, and that is what the client's going to hit to access the web API. Well, what happens is when the Power Server project runs and creates the C# code, what it generates is this line I've commented out: application URL, and it puts in the HTTP, the port, the host name. 0.0.0.0 just means it's listing on all host names for the local machine, and then 443 indicating we're doing HTTPS. But then it put in a /web API, and that's not actually the correct syntax, and that's actually not exactly what it generates. The closing quotes on the other side of that. But this is what we actually need to have, and so this is where I had to go in and edit. This is the launch settings JSON file that got created in the C# code. And we need to take the path that we're going to be having the web API listening on, and we need to put it as a separate line here called launch URL, and take it off the application URL. If you don't do that, what you're going to do is you're going to get a message indicating that it's something like, you must use set path or something to and you can also do it. It's either I think it's in the startup or the program file. You can do it there, but it's just as easy to do it here in the launch settings.json file. So you wonder what happened to that port 5000. Well, what's happening is I'm going to be running this in Kestrel in Azure, but IIS is fronting that. And so what our client is talking to is IIS listening on point 443, and then IIS is handing those web requests off to the web API running in Kestrel that's listening on 5000. And so this is kind of what that architecture looks like. A little too fast. And so here's our Power Server client, and it's working always off of point 443. And so it talks to the Cloud Publisher on 443, talks to the app client on 443, and it talks to the web API in 443. And then those are handed off to Kestrel, and then Kestrel talks to the database. Or the web API app in Kestrel talks to the database. Okay, so we've got the files in our web deploy configured the way we want. I'm going to create a single zip file from those. And then I'm going to go into my FTP client, and I'm going to give it the FTP credentials that were in that deployment file that we downloaded. And this is what I was talking about here earlier. I'm not sure it's really that obvious, but this is the root. We don't FTP right into the www root. We FTP 2 levels higher, and there's no way that I know of in Azure to change the default folder that you FTP into to point to www root. And so, like I said, if you attempted to do the FTP deploy from Power Builder, it would end up in this folder, not down here where we need it. So this is why I'm doing the FTP using FileZilla. So I navigate down to the www root, and then I copy over my 3 folders into that folder, in the root of the IIS server. Okay. Now remember, I said I've got web API listening on a path. Well, we need to define that path, and so now this is why I wanted to use Windows rather than Linux to deploy this. This is my app service. I go into configuration. I go into the path mappings. I create a new virtual application or directory. I uncheck the directory, and I put in /web API. And at that point, it should start working. So let's take a look at a demo. Okay, and the demo is not going to be particularly involved here. I'm just going to launch. Now you notice that this is running out of my Azure Websites domain. And the app launcher triggered, and it's going to download the files. And I'm going to log in, and there's my running Power Builder app deployed out of Azure. So that's about all there is to the demo.